in any way, shape, or form. But I'm Emlyn. I'm the Executive Director of Healthy Congregations. I'm glad to see you all here this afternoon. Many of you are part of this network, the membership network, because you're associated with our organization as a facilitator of workshops or one of our educators who prepares people to present the workshops. Some of you are from our leadership series, which is the every year, once a month event where people learn more about Bowen theory, Friedman application, and one's own personal family and ministry setting coaching. And then I think that a couple of you have connected through various other opportunities that we've had, including through our connections at seminaries. Right now we're at the Methodist Theological School in Delaware, and we've previously been in Trinity Lutheran Seminary. So welcome to all of you. This is a really important and challenging time in the life of faith communities. I'm telling people we're in a new Reformation. So therefore, the challenges to ministry leaders are profound and deep, and how we handle that is something that is important. So all of you should have or will receive a copy of the Healthy Congregations Book of the Year in 2019, how your, family systems and congregational life, a map for ministry. So our conversation partner today is the Reverend Dr. R. Robert Creech. Robert is he's waving his hand there. He is the Rayburn Professor of Pastoral Leadership, and he's Director of Pastoral Ministries at Truett Seminary, which is located on, is a graduate school of Baylor University in Waco. I would say that Robert is one among us who had a taste of just about every aspect of ministry. And you can see, if you've had a chance to read Family Systems and Congregational Life, you get a taste of that based on his stories. He's a New Testament scholar and has served congregations for 22 years, I would say, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, full time. And now, as someone who teaches, he's also doing interim ministry on an ongoing basis. So he keeps his toes in the world of ministry practice and leadership. And I just found out this morning that he and his spouse live in a residence hall at Baylor University, along with 160 first-year college students, men. So that in itself is a ministry worth concentrating on, Robert. It was really interesting way to think about putting into action what you believe about how people are together. So we get to have this conversation today. And this conversation was advertised. I've done these before with other technology, though, around having a conversation between myself and the guest. But I have some questions to visit with Robert about, but there will be time for engagement with Robert with the rest of you as well. So I'm going to set it up so that I'm going to invite each one of you to introduce yourself to start this time together. Really briefly name what your ministry is and where you are. I think it's a good idea to get an idea of how widespread we are in this network. And then Robert and I will talk for a little bit, and then I will invite you to offer any questions or comments for a period of time at the closing, probably half hour, 45 minutes of our time. So, Sean Barrett, would you start? And we're probably in different configurations on each one of our computers, so I'll guide and invite the next person to speak. So Sean, would you introduce yourself first?
My name is Sean Barrett. I'm currently serving as a ELCA pastor in Salisbury, North Carolina, and fairly recent graduate. I'm a first call, graduated from Trinity in 2014, and I'm currently in a DMIN program at Methesco.
Okay, good to have you here, Sean. Mark Bogan.
Yes, I am called by Northwestern Ohio Synod ELCA to interim ministry, currently at St. John's in Bellevue, Ohio. I've been here since July 1st, and just getting a transition team going here. So I'm doing some healthy congregations workshops with Rob Johnson. So those have been going well.
So are you part of the resource team there in Northwest Ohio, Mark?
No, I'm not.
Okay, all right.
No.
Good to have you here. And Mark did our leadership series also.
Yes.
In
A couple years ago, yes.
Yeah, you passed. Gail Zackerson. I'm going to unmute you.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
I live in Pennsylvania, but I'm just about to start an interim situation with two small congregations that are yoked together in the Warren, Ohio area. And I've heard lots of conflict stuff from them. So it's going to be interesting and a little bit scary. I've preached there the last 3 weeks. They have a very tight schedule between worship services. And I will try to do a lot of Bowen theory with them. And I'm currently reading a book, Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolsinger. It's dripping with Bowen theory.
Yeah.
Emlyn, you must have read that or something.
Yeah, thanks.
So that's where we.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to mute you again, Gail. Thank you for that, just because there's still some static. But Robert referred to that book earlier in our conversation, and we may kind of mention that as we go along. And maybe we might just invite the author to be part of this. But Elizabeth Hoster.
My name is Elizabeth Hoster. I am an Episcopal priest living in Columbus, Ohio, and currently serving a congregation in Washington Courthouse, Ohio, rural community, Lutheran and Episcopal churches coming together.
Thank you. Tony.
Is it me you're after, Emlyn?
Tony Wilgus, sorry.
Good afternoon, Tony Wilgus here. I've been working together during this past year and a half or so with Emlyn at the co-facilitating the leadership series. I live in Oberlin, Ohio, married to a Unitarian Universalist minister who is currently doing interim work. In fact, I'm up in Traverse City, Michigan, while she begins her first of 5 months up here in Traverse City. I was a social work professor before and got involved in the Bowen postgraduate program back in 1979. So like many slow learners, I'm still at it.
So it just so happens, at least in my screen, the two social workers are next to each other. So Dick Betcher.
Hi, I'm Richard Betcher. I'm a retired social work professor from Ohio State, official title Professor Emeritus, I guess. I'm on the board of Healthy Congregations. I've been on the board for now about a year. I'm still learning the ropes about that organization. And I'm also a member of the Southern Synodical Congregational Resource Team, appointed by the bishop to help congregations with issues that arise in the course of simply living from day to day. I have been a student of family systems theory from a variety of perspectives and used it, of course, in my classrooms. When I was teaching direct service practice, I morphed into administration and management, so I'm returning now to the family systems literature and looking forward to today's conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Dick. Donna Robertson.
Here we go. I'm Donna Robertson. My call has been through ministry through music, and currently do work with the Presbytery for retreat ministry mission group, and trainer and facilitator with healthy congregations in the Presbytery.
Thanks, Donna. Myra.
I'm Myra Fazard. I live near Pittsburgh, and I call myself a professional volunteer. I've worked with healthy congregations for probably a decade or more, and thoroughly enjoy systems. I think everyone should know systems.
So you're contributing to that effort.
Yes.
Thanks, Myra. Thank you. Myra's a trainer in our system and has been for a while. Bob Holly.
Hello. I am an ELCA ordained pastor who is retired, 47 years ordained. I do training and facilitate workshops. When I crossed workshop number 100, I decided I would retire from facilitating, but still do training online. I am a co-author with Paul Walters of Called by God to Serve, which is published by Augsburg to be used by leadership and congregations, which supplements the workshops.
And did I understand you're publishing a new edition? Is that right?
We have a proposal into actually right now, Emlyn, and Scott Tunseth tells us within a week or so he should be back to us about that proposal. So it looks like we may be writing again.
Okay.
And by the way, I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
Thanks, Bob. Julianne Smack.
Hi, I am serving St. Mark Lutheran Church in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Had been part of the leadership series for a couple of years and have had a few years since I've done that, but I've just been trying to reconnect. So
It's good to have you here.
thanks.
Great. Skip.
I'm a retired United Methodist pastor in the 50th year of ministry. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, actually south of Nashville in Brentwood, Tennessee. What I'm doing in retirement is coaching and consulting a lot of healthy congregations.
That's great. Thanks, Skip. Scott.
I'm Scott Woolridge, and I serve out of Bloomington, Illinois. I'm in our tiny little office here in Bloomington today. I'm with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Illinois and Wisconsin. So our middle judicatory has trained almost 50 healthy congregation facilitators in the past 25 years. And we've just revived that group, still working with about a dozen facilitators where we meet monthly online via Zoom. And we do that the fourth Monday of every month. That has been extremely fruitful. We had face-to-face meetings for a number of years, but now the Zoom meetings really help us engage, and we're in congregational life and developing more resources and training and helping people brush up on their skills.
Wonderful, Scott. I think I need to connect you with the person who I see next to you is going to speak as Martin Billmeyer, who's the chair of our board. I'm glad to hear that there's good things going on with you. Yeah, Martin.
My name is Martin Billmeyer. I am a Lutheran pastor in Toledo, Ohio, celebrating 25 years at the parish where I am right now, and 32 years in the ministry. And as Emlyn said, I am chairing the Healthy Congregations Board right now. I've enrolled in the leadership series for 9 years in a row now. And I also serve on the Congregational Resource Team in Northwestern Ohio Synod of the ELCA, which brings the Healthy Congregations curriculum to the Synod congregations.
Great. Thanks, Martin. Tom.
Am I on now?
You're on. It's you.
Okay. Hello. Yeah. Hey. Yeah. I'm a Healthy Congregations facilitator and I guess trainer of trainers, and I'm a priest in the Episcopal Church in Clifton Park, New York.
Mhm. Great to have you here. That's
Thank
great.
you.
Someone's timer is going on. Martha Creek, can you hear me? Lynn Knockham, yes, can you, would you introduce yourself?
I'm in a public place. I'm going to
Okay.
wait. I mean, if it frees up, I will in a minute.
Okay, thank you for letting us know. And Lynn Nakamura, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Lynn Nakamura. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Lynn Nakamura. I am the administrator for Healthy Congregations. I am also serving as interim director of candidacy for the Southern Ohio Synod of the ELCA. So those things keep me busy. A former faculty member at Trinity Lutheran Seminary with Emlyn. And so I'm happy to be here lurking behind the scenes watching you all. So hopefully helping to make this event happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Lynn. Then I'd like to introduce to you Robert Creech and invite him to say a few words in addition to the introduction that I gave. But welcome, Robert.
Well, greetings. Thank you for letting a Baptist and a Texan be with you all today. It's 76 degrees and sunny outside here. And
rub it in.
Yeah. I tell people in the spring it's like this every day in Waco, but in September it'd be 176 degrees and sunny. So it is a privilege to be with you. This is really the first conversation that I've gotten to have about this book, and that's one of the things I enjoy about doing this is interacting with people who are in practice and who understand something about the theory and about ministry and its challenges. And this is where I learn most of what I learn is by rubbing shoulders with folks like you. And I love the church, and it's just a privilege to be part of this conversation with you and the work you're doing together.
Thank you.
So yeah, and then one thing you should also know about Baylor University is that our women's basketball team is in the Sweet 16. We're the #1 team in the nation ranking, and we're still hoping that there's glory to follow, but we'll see. But
you would live with something else, though.
Yeah, we don't live and die by that, but it's fun.
Well, so, but I'm really curious. Now I've known you for a while, Robert. We did something together a number of years ago here in Columbus, but I'm intrigued by the fact that how honest and open you were about your own kind of putting things together around family systems theory and your own leadership experience in congregational ministry. But you use the word misery in your description of what led you to search for a grounding. So I'm wondering if you could say something about what your initial curiosity about the development of this map, the idea of a map, and what helped you persist in responding to the misery.
Okay. Well, kind of my testimony is that around 1994, a number of things began to fall apart in life about that time. I was 42 years old. I'd been a pastor at the church for 7 years at University Baptist in Houston. And everything was just wonderful on one day, and then photographed the next day and everything started to crumble. I had a coworker who was a dear friend and a staff member who was discovered to be involved in a clergy sexual abuse situation with one of our members. Shortly after that, my 7th grade son got kicked out of school for possession of marijuana. My dad, this is all happening between August the 19th and December 24th. My dad, who was 76 and had emphysema, went into the hospital for the final time and died on Christmas Eve, which was, I conducted his funeral on my birthday 2 days later. And I mean, there were just incoming things, family, congregation from everywhere. And I wasn't too, I mean, I was very heavily invested in what was going on in the congregation, but my misery was far more about my family. And in the year that followed, I found myself in a very depressed state and looking for help. And I had read Friedman's Generation to Generation book right after it came out at the recommendation of a friend. And I thought it was interesting, a nifty idea. Didn't know quite what to make of it. It wasn't easy at that time. We didn't have the internet back then, and Amazon wasn't, I didn't know where in the world I'd find a copy of this Bowen guy's writings that he referenced. And so I kind of put it on the shelf and just let it be. And around 1993 or so, no, 1995 or so, in the year that followed this, I pulled it off and read it again and started snooping around and found that Victoria Harrison, who was on the faculty at the Bowen Center, was also a resident of Houston, and I had a program there, and I began to meet with her as a coach. And first, it was just, I was just trying to save my family and my family's life. It was, our anxious response there is hard to overestimate. And so we pulled out of what I would call a regression there, and I was finding it useful. And then it began to be clear to me that this was also quite useful in congregational life. It was just a way of thinking about my relationships overall. And I continued to work with Victoria and attend meetings, and after a time began to try to do some writing and thinking about it. But what drove me to it was not because I thought it was a nifty idea. I was looking for a lifeline, and it proved to be a very useful one for me.
I was thinking about, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, about the fact that, well, for one thing, generation to generation is very complex and deep. And unless you've walked the road, it's hard to really get at what the point that Friedman's trying to make about the dynamics. So the level of pain precedes the impetus to search for something that would challenge and help us persist. So I was thinking about, and in my case, I got physically ill is what the prompt was for me. And then to look for ways to respond to that and take care of that. And I think about the different ways anxiety works its way in our families and in our congregations. It's part of the history that we
yeah. I'm sure there are some people that come to the theory and effectively use it because it just strikes them intellectually as, making sense, and they start working and practicing it. But for me, it was much more driven by kind of a, what else can I do right now? And it did prove helpful for me and my family. And so I kind of came into it out of, as I said, out of a bit of misery rather than intellectual curiosity or something.
And it's interesting because you're bright and you're someone who enjoys thinking and so on, but that you naturally came into a focus on your family that is at the heart of Bowen theory. But many of us clergy look at it as come into it through the congregational lens.
Yeah.
So how to keep both things related to each other in some way.
I think one of the most helpful ideas that I got from Friedman, and I use this all the time in thinking with students, is the idea that clergy are involved in these three overlapping systems of our own family, the families of the congregation, and the family that is the congregation. And that made a huge amount of sense to me, because you had this anxious family dealing with its problems and an anxious congregation. And I'm sure the pastor of that congregation was bringing all that anxiety home with this clergy sexual abuse situation and trying to negotiate that. And being anxious at home didn't help the situation with a 12-year-old son. And that didn't help going back to the congregation. I mean, those things were, the boundaries between those two systems was very, very permeable. And it became really clear to me that working on one, which was for me the more important one at the time, the more threatened one, really ultimately had an impact on the other as well over a couple of years.
So I spent some time this past week with two different groups of clergy, a variety of different denominations, who were, for preparing for me to come, were reading, actually read your book and read a couple of other things, and but had a very, say, a skeptical view on Bowen theory and Friedman. And basically a number of them said, you know, this is really outdated. You know, Bowen and Friedman did something 50s, 60s, 70s, that's, you know, but there are reasons that you give in your book that demonstrate that this approach is beyond being outdated. So I would have loved to have had you beside me in this conversation with them to hear what you would say in response. That what would you say in response to these? Actually,
one question. I might ask a question like, when did that happen? When did it become suddenly outdated? The fact that Bowen's approach is to provide a scientific explanation of human behavior, and not American human behavior or white human behavior or male human behavior, but human behavior across the species. And if he's successful, then it will not ever become outdated. It is a part of who we are as human beings. And the fact that I can go back and read the patriarch stories, or read the stories of King David and his family, and read those same anxious responses, that same limited number of anxious responses that adhere across culture and across time, kind of suggests to me Bowen might have been onto something, that he's, I don't think it becomes outdated. I think it is one of the things that describes human beings, and we don't change in 50 years as a species. So I still see these same reactions in myself and others. I see what I experience, that what he describes accurately matches the territory that I'm trying to negotiate. And so it's still a map for me. Until the territory changes, I don't think the map becomes outdated. And the territory of human relationships seems to have stayed much the same to me. And generally what I would say is, you know, if you haven't tried this, if you haven't worked on differentiation of self and haven't started observing this reactivity in self and others, you can have all kinds of ideas about it. But I would suggest you might want to wade into it and try it to decide if it's accurate or not. But I don't know which part of it might be outdated. I'd want to know that.
Yeah, and I think that this was in reference to perceiving that those who talk about this, and you and I talked about this earlier too, is a white male development that doesn't take into consideration the experience of multicultural life and women's voices and so on.
Yeah.
But I mean, there are a number of women who are involved in, some among us here, who are working in this area, thinking deeply about systems theory and the map that you're describing too. So I think it was what is current anxiety focused on? It's focused on trauma, and it's focused on multicultural things, obviously partly related to our political situation as well.
I found students from across cultures find ways of identifying with the theory when I presented in classroom. I would agree that, you know, I've been to a few hours of conferences related to Bowen theory from one organization or another, and there is very little color in the room. And I would that we had a more diverse conversation about this across cultures. Somebody else can go figure out why that is, but I haven't had students of other races or nationalities or ethnicities come to me and say, that doesn't work. You know, what I'm listening to doesn't describe life in my family. They seem to find ways of identifying with that. And so I think Bowen was right that it is human behavior. Now, communicating the system and the theory, the map across cultures may be still a challenge for folk who work in this area, but we don't get many either at the secular or the clergy level who are participating in this who come from other cultural backgrounds. Although there was a conference, a major international conference held in Hong Kong, last year, I think. Maybe there's some traction. I mean, to say that Bowen did this 50, 60 years ago sounds like a long time. It's not. I mean, there's a lot of time for for ideas to get traction, and maybe it's going to take time and effort to do that.
So I was at the conference and I did a workshop, and I would say 80% of the people in the workshop were African and Asian, primarily Chinese and some West African. And we had a lively conversation, and it had to do, the workshop was around becoming a healthier pastor. And so these were people involved in ministry of all kinds, but absolutely relating. I wonder if it's the voices that are presented to introduce some of these things if we could diversify that, that would be really important. But they mostly read Ron Richardson's books. That's what they had been looking at. So, not everyone probably has had a chance to read your book completely, but I wonder if you would share with us what's distinctive about what you call the third way leadership in your book. Say something.
I contrast it with two other. I teach leadership classes, and I'm just kind of overwhelmed. You start Googling the word leadership and you get several million hits. You add Christian leadership to it, it's still an overwhelming number. Go to Amazon and search and you get this big number of books. The fact that we are so intrigued with the concept of leadership, and there's so many theories out there, kind of leads me to think we don't have it figured out yet, but we're very interested in it. And we live in what I think Friedman would term a leaderless time right now. There's not, in our country and in many of the much of the corporate world. So the kind of leadership stuff that's offered is, for me, a kind of snake oil, trying to fix everything, is leadership is a bag of tricks, that if you learn you do these things and people are going to follow you and you're going to be a leader. There's a category of stuff out there like that, workshops and books. And then there's another that is a little more thoughtful, but it's about leadership principles, trying to extract what are the principles of leadership. I think about in church, a lot of folks are familiar with John MacArthur's the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. And my line for that is, they may be irrefutable, so I'm not going to argue with them, but I can't remember 21 things. So what do I do in a given situation with which law applies? And, that just doesn't seem helpful to me. Mm-hmm. But the third way for me is, if you have a way of viewing not leadership, but human relationships that you've become familiar with, and I can remember 8 principles, 8 concepts in Bowen theory, and I can remember 4 or 5, depending on how you divide them, anxious responses that are part of the emotional reactivity. I can remember those, I can monitor those, and I can think about situations from a perspective, a map, if you will. And so I don't have to carry laws in my mind or you have techniques to manipulate systems or people. I can think about what's going on, what's my part in it, how's the anxiety showing up, what's changed from yesterday when it wasn't so anxious and now it's symptomatic, and what's my part in it, how do I change my part? Those are things I can think about in almost any situation without having to be an expert in a list of things. So I call it third way, just in the sense of, it's not a list of techniques. It doesn't tell you what to do. It's not even a list of laws or principles. It's a way of seeing human relationships, and leadership is inherently relational. Friedman in Failure of Nerve has to paraphrase what he said, he basically says, differentiation of self makes any leadership theory look good. And the failure to work on differentiation will also result in the failure of just about any leadership theory. So I don't do, in my leadership class, I don't have them read any leadership theories. I just don't think that's very useful, frankly. We did read Canoeing the Mountains, which is not so much a leadership theory as it is a discussion about leading under circumstances where the world is changing and we've never been there before. And it's a good, thoughtful, I think, response to that question. But you still need a leader who is a person who is understands reactivity and relationships.
Yeah, again, it goes back to the framework of Bowen theory, doesn't it? That are these things descriptions about how people are together, and then when one works on one's own principles and maturity, what can happen in family and in community. It's just a little drop of change, but it can make a very big difference. Why a map? Why are you talking about a map? What's important?
I think I've been using that metaphor for a long time for myself, and the difference, the thing about a map is it is not the territory. The territory in this case is human relationships. And so I need to know, how do I negotiate my way through that territory? And to have an accurate map is to have an accurate description of the territory that you can use to guide you through that. And I think that's a bit what Bowen did, and others have added to, is said, this is what's going on in the territory. These are the pitfalls and routes and things that you can pay attention to that can help you negotiate that territory. And so map has just been a good way of thinking about theory, period. I mean, if it was another theory about something else, I would ask, what's the territory and what's the map? But the theory is not reality. The theory are a set of ideas, but the territory is human relationships, which I think is what all ministry is girded in. So this map for me is one that really helps in ministry, whether I'm preaching or doing pastoral care or leadership, spiritual direction, whatever. If relationships are what we're dealing with, then how do we think about those? So it's been useful for me to use that metaphor.
I think that because it's something people can relate to also in their everyday life, although GPS is a whole different ball of wax. But
yeah, I got Holly Ordway's permission to use a map, a poem she wrote there just across from the content page, which I thought was a really interesting poem there about now GPS puts me right in the center, a Ptolemaic shift in my perspective, pinned where I am right now somewhere. I turn and turn to orient myself. I have directions calculated, maps at hand, hopelessly lost till I look up at last. But just the shift from using paper maps to these digital things that don't really tell us that much about the territory, but they tell us where we are and where to go next, I thought it was an interesting poem.
I thought it was really good too. And I've often been frustrated in my use of GPS, even though it gets me someplace, but I don't have a bigger picture.
Right.
What's surrounding.
Hates the digital map. That she is a map person, and we have more maps in our possession than you can imagine. And always in our car there are maps, and it's always dangerous when she pulls one out because you never know where it's going to take us, because she's going to go, I think we could get there this way, and so you might as well just turn where she says and do it. But she doesn't like the maps that just tell you turn right here, turn left here, because you get done, you get where you wanted to go, but you have no idea where you've been.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Yeah. I think that theory helps with. I mean, that's why theory as a map is useful to me it's a bigger picture of the whole territory of what's going on, not just what do I do in this situation, pull out this gimmick or this tool or this technique or this law. Think broadly about what's happening. This person who's making a mess in the church may be dealing, and is likely dealing with some anxiety in their life that doesn't show up when they walked into the pastor's office. You don't know what's going there, and it just helps me. Knowing that helps me cut them a little slack and probably ask different questions, and maybe be a little bit more empathetic and less reactive to them, just knowing that they don't operate in a vacuum any more than I do.
So I ask you, as someone who has been now in a seminary setting for a while, given all of that, what do you see as the major challenges of people who are being formed to go into this world
Mm,
of change and what Pete Steinke calls uproar right now.
yeah.
How do you see all of this? How does Truett look at that? How
Mm,
do you see it? Because I think I see a lot of seminaries being treated like the identified patient in some way, projected on this is where the problem is rather than a place where creativity.
yeah.
can be.
Well, in December, hang on for just a second. In December, I was asked to preach at convocation at our commencement. And I chose an interesting text for a seminary graduation. Jesus' words in Matthew 10, I send you out as sheep among wolves. I mean, I think our students are leaving here to go into a very dangerous world in many ways. Maybe not physically so, but there are just so many things in congregations now because of the anxiety and the culture. And at the top of that list that I would just speak of fear. I just think there is so much fear. People are so afraid of everything. And we've got a whole media, piece in our culture that's main point is to generate fear and make us afraid of each other. And it's working. Yeah, it's working really well. I think that's their biggest challenge. I think they're facing a much more anxious world than I faced when I went into ministry. Maybe not. Maybe I just didn't know it back then. But what I see as I'm interim pastor and some in churches and pay attention to churches is the anxiety in the world is really making its way into the walls of our congregations and the life of those congregations. And our faith is our Christian faith and truth and doctrine is not necessarily remedying that. And often the anxiety gets stirred up more at church than when they came in, depending on who they talked to that day or what the pastor preached about. So we talk with them about that, and I think it's helpful for them to have a way of thinking about managing themselves in that context and not getting caught up in it one way or another or running from it, either one.
Thinking about the capacity to run toward things and work on equipping oneself to stay in it is really a piece of formation. It takes a while struggling with things. I'm getting ready to do a funeral this Saturday, and I've talked to you about this, and one of the things I noticed, and I have not done a funeral in a while, is that there was no centerpiece to the preparation for the funeral as I would have experienced 20 years ago, so that people were going to all different sources instead of a sense that this would be the process that we would think about together. So it's like different locuses of solidity not working together. So we had to really manage a lot more my anxiety than not mine and others as well than I would have expected.
So.
So you make a case in the book for the application of systems thinking in every aspect of ministry. Is there one aspect of ministry that you think has more impact than another in terms of developing maturity, both in someone who's a ministry leader or follower, or in a congregation or a community as a whole? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I have come to think about what I refer to as the domains of pastoral ministry. Other people, I'm sure it's written down somewhere, and I didn't make this up, but let me see if I can. Let me draw something for you. Okay.
Oh.
As kind of like a Venn diagram of that, our task, the shepherding task of feeding, leading, and caring for the sheep are the domains of pastoral ministry for me. And so all those overlap in important ways that in proclamation, I'm also maybe feeding the sheep, but I may also be leading. I may also be expressing pastoral care. The people, when I walk into the hospital room, who have been listening to faithful preaching for a number of years are much more open to my care experiences. The people that have been cared for in difficult times are more open to one's leadership or one's preaching. I think those things are just, they're not easily separated. We can separate them for conversation. But so in response to what you asked, I think all of those are relational things. Whether I'm preaching or doing pastoral care or leadership, I'm in relationship. And my differentiation or lack of it, my emotional maturity or lack of it, will be affected in those relationships and will affect. So I could be, I think, the more I work on myself, on differentiation, the better job I can do in any one of those things, the more effective I think I can be. And the more emotionally reactive or emotionally immature I am, the more I'm sort of vulnerable in those relationships and it will affect how I preach, how I do pastoral care, how I lead. I'm a little inclined as a Baptist maybe to put more emphasis on the preaching than the others, but I don't think for a minute that those can be done not effectively, without relationship to each other.
And I think the integrity of the consistency across all of those aspects of ministry is important investment in differentiation too. I describe it as showing that you're the real deal too. What you preach is how you are. Those two things being close.
And in preaching, you are who you are in those relationships when you're sitting alone in your study and you're interacting. Hopefully the congregation is, in a sense, they're present with you. These words you're preparing, they're not just to be spoken into the air, they're spoken to particular people whom you know. I much prefer doing interim pastoral work than supply preaching, just filling in at a congregation that I don't know anyone. It's not a pleasant experience for me, probably not for the congregation either. So, but to have to look into the eyes and know who's in the second pew and who's at the back of the room and what they're going through, all of that is a part of preaching as a pastor for me. And so, even alone in my study, the congregation is present, and so it's about relationships even then. And the less mature I am, I'm concerned about how will so-and-so hear this? Who in the congregation am I hoping will like this the most? There's a lot of kind of thoughts that can flow through the preacher's mind while preaching or while preparing that are indicative of our maturity or lack of it. There's all kinds of things. So I think these acts of ministry are both affected by the level of emotional maturity that we possess, but they also can be shapers of it. They're every one a chance to lean into our immaturity and to be challenged by that. Every sermon we preach or hospital or call we make or funeral we conduct or wedding or counseling session or a business meeting is a chance to lean into our immaturity and to be shaped by it. But
it's nicely said, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit and ask you, Robert, if you have a question that you'd like to ask of the gathered here. And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to invite Don Ryder to unmute and just introduce himself. Everyone previously has said their name, what they're involved in, and where they're located. So Don, would you be willing to do that, please?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes.
I'm Don Ryder. I'm from Melbourne, Florida, halfway down the East Coast. I just tuned in late because we finished with the Voyagers with Kathy Weissman across the state. And before I drove home, I wanted to tune in.
That's great.
happy to be with you.
That's great. Wonderful. I'm glad you're able to do these multiple things, Don. That's pretty impressive. And Jan Knowlton Carter, would you introduce yourself?
The Pilgrims, a Presbyterian congregation. And I am a transitional minister. I do this and then I also teach it.
So
Jen, I didn't hear where you were from.
Yes.
Sorry, Church of the Pilgrims in Washington, D.C. I'm a Presbyterian pastor.
Okay.
Welcome. Glad you're here.
Thank you.
So, Robert, I heard you say in your introduction that you would like to, kind of have a give and take here. Is there a question that you might like to ask or make an observation for response to this group of all very, well, they're here for a reason to engage in thinking too.
Well, given that you all have been working for some time at integrating and practicing theory along with congregational life and ministry, I'd be interested to hear what you have found to be in ministry, maybe the more challenging place to think systems and be faithful with that. I mean, that could be anything from some aspect of ministry to some aspect of theology, but where has your ministry and the theory or your Christian theology and theory, where have they rubbed up against each other in ways that you haven't really resolved yet? I'd be interested to know that.
Does anyone have any thoughts? I'll give you some time too. Toughest spots. No tough spots.
Matter of settling on one of them.
I think that's a tough, this is Jan, I think that's a tough question because at least in the work that I do, I'm constantly thinking about systems. But it's one of those things where, and we can constantly be better at it. I think there's no, kind of nirvana. I participate in a clergy group that is facilitated by a social worker who looks at, she was Edwin.
I think
is through a systems lens. And so it's really helpful both to map out the church system, but also to map out our family systems. And every single time that we do that, the hot spots in the family system match the hot spots in the church system. And it's fascinating to me. So I think just having the continual conversation about how systems play out both in our own lives and in the life of the congregation is helpful. And in the work that I do, helping to move a congregation from, one place that it thought it was with a particular leader to whatever the next chapter is, we have to be thinking about that all the time. And for instance, we were joking just the other day that there's a highly introverted leadership team. And when I have people come as guests, we have to kind of pause. We can't talk too much because everybody looks down. And so I warn my guests when they come to talk with us, that's going to happen. Well, what happens? Like the previous pastor was an off the scale introvert. Like, this has just permeated the whole system. And so we just have to be mindful of it and name it and talk about it and talk about the ways that plays out, in this particular system. So I think it's not so much, it's hard. It's hard to keep getting better at it, which is why I'm listening to this conversation.
Any other thoughts? Get stirred by the question?
I want to talk about the challenges that I see is trying to get the congregation to see itself as a system And when I go around to different congregations and do workshops, two mantras that I say over and over again. Number one, that because it's the body of Christ, everybody is a child of God. And so we all have our own experiences and we all have our own spirituality and so forth. And so because of that, we're all entitled to our own opinion. But because we're part of the body of Christ, even though we're all entitled to our own opinion, none of us is entitled to our own way. And then the second mantra I use is that when you join a church and you become part of that system, we have to recognize that it's not all about you, even though it should be, or we think it should be. It's not all about you. It's all about the body. It's all about the mission. And yet, at the same time, it is all about you because it's all about your functioning. And your functioning contributes to the health of the system or the congregation, or your functioning contributes to the unhealth. And I use personal examples from ministry showing how one person acting in a differentiated manner can influence the whole congregation. And I have some concrete examples I use for that. But the idea to get the congregation to understand itself as a system and what that means is a big challenge.
Not really used to thinking that way, particularly in this culture. It's far more individualized, and it is hard to get people to think differently about that.
So, Emlyn, the thing that I think about, I have not had a chance to read your book yet, but I know that you start out talking about preaching, but that's an area that I do have, there are other elements of ministry that seem to connect well in my mind with systems thinking, but preaching has not been one. So I don't know if that's something you could speak to.
Yeah, as I thought about it, one is just identifying the reality that I think of it as a relational task. It is not a anonymous speaker coming to an anonymous group of people to deliver a generic, TED talk or something. This is, I have a story in there about one of my students who is pastor of a rural church, and he was in a local Starbucks working on preparing a sermon one day. He had his Bible there and his laptop, and he was working away. And this other customer, a lady, came over to him. She said, "Do you mind if I ask what you're doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm a pastor and I'm preparing a sermon for this Sunday." She said, "Well, what will you be preaching about?" And he gave her the biblical text and a topic. And she said, "Well, do you think you're preparing the best sermon that's ever been written on this topic?" And he said, "No, I don't." And she said, "Well, why don't you just go find the best sermon that's ever been written and preach that?" And so he was able to articulate to her, that's not how I think about preaching. It's very contextual, and with these people in this hour, in this place, in our history, and our needs. But I think it's inherently relational. That's one thing, which means we are inherently vulnerable given our level of differentiation. And we can be preaching sort of at the lower end of the scale where we are trying to please people, or we're afraid to address difficult topics, or we're not even sure what preaching is. We haven't thought our own principles out about what we mean when we say we're doing that. Or we can be further up the scale and have more clarity about what we believe about preaching, and maybe a little less, in a sense, preachiness about our proclamation, where we are not telling people what they must believe, but we are not afraid to say what we do believe. We can use a little more prophetic preaching that contains more we and not you. I think a lot of what people refer to as prophetic preaching is often not like the prophets at all. I hear the prophets preaching with broken hearts about the sin of the nation, And we tend to preach with a little bit of joy, a little more Jonathan Edwards and the spider kind of stuff. And I think over time, I think that a pastor faithfully preaching from a more mature position might open the system up a little more, where people are willing to listen and not become as reactive when there is a difficult topic. I don't have any research on that. That's my thinking. It should work in relationships that over time, if we are able to speak less anxiously about difficult things and be open to listening to other people when the sermon's over, that the system should open up a little bit more. But that's where I've tried to think about it in relationship to preaching, Julianne. It seems to me that the more mature the pastor, the preacher, likely the preaching is going to be affected by that, because it is relational. It's not just, an anonymous speaker coming in to deliver an anonymous message.
So when I think about what's happening in many churches now, where they're being served in some ways by a rotating group of preachers, I just think about that relative to what you're saying. One could be able to say, give an interpretation and not worry about consequences, I guess, or kind of give a universal piece. But you're suggesting, I think, which I understand, is that in the relational task of proclamation, the community gets formed in some way or another, helps get formed.
I think about a church I served as interim pastor for a year and a half, following the death by suicide of their pastor of 20 years at age 69. It was a very anxious congregation. But we were celebrating, I'd been there a little more than a year, and in the fall we were celebrating season of creation in September, using some alternative lectionary passages for that instead of just the ordinary days passages. But I had a congregation full of petroleum engineers. You have to figure out how are you going to say what you want to say, what needs to be said in a way that they can hear it. And also in that congregation, I had not only scientists, but people who thought science is a little questionable. There are plenty of those still around. And so when, I managed to offend both groups, I think. But you can't ignore who's sitting in the pews and figure out a way. How do I say what I in principle believe and think the text teaches in a way that these particular people can hear it and not just get something off my chest? I mean, there's more for me to preaching than, just feeling good when I leave because I said something hard. Well, if nobody heard it, then I'm not sure that how much preaching took place there. So those are the challenges I think we work through relationally when we are pastors to a group of people and we know them and we're not just stepping in for the week or something like that. And the longer we're with people, the more in a sense, the more difficult it becomes to be their prophet, and the easier. Those are the relational challenges. It's easy to be the pastor, the shepherd, or difficult to be the prophet, and yet both things may be necessary at different times.
So that may relate to what our colleague said earlier about having this place where you can talk about keeping an outside view and someone challenging you to look at what might need to be prophetic in what's going on and not play into comfort and not challenge.
It would be disingenuous and it would just be an outright falsity to preach on creation care and pretend that I'm not complicit in the destruction of creation. There's got to be a lot more we than you there. About what we do, what we can do, and be, getting under the word ourselves instead of pretending to be at some higher place that we've got it figured out and we don't damage the environment. We're not complicit in that. So that'd be an example, I think.
Julianne, do you have any response to that or thoughts? This was your question.
I don't think I can go on.
Yeah, I got you unmuted finally.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I think you're exactly right. I appreciate especially what you were just talking about in terms of being able to bring that prophetic word, like that speaks to me, and as opposed to the word of comfort, and knowing how, having been served this congregation for a long time, it's kind of the challenge between that. So yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, I think affection for our congregants, for our congregation, is a indispensable element of pastoral ministry. If we don't love these people, have affection for them in some way, I don't know how we can very well be their pastors. But it's that same developing of affection for them that makes it difficult to be their prophet. We may be their priest and not their prophet and that's the relational challenge, I think, of preaching and other pieces of the ministry is these are actually people that matter to us. They are significant people in our life, and therefore our vulnerability to relationships, our lack of differentiation, can hinder our capacity to serve in the most effective way. And so a little improvement on that goes a long way, I think. But one of my favorite illustrations that this helped me was thinking about baseball is the difference between somebody who bats .250 lifetime and somebody that bats .350 lifetime. A baseball player that bats .250 lifetime is not Hall of Fame material, and they may have survived the major leagues for a career. But if they bat .350 lifetime, they're going to be in the Hall of Fame. They're going to be able to name their own salary. I mean, huge amount of difference between those two players. But the difference in performance is that one player gets one more hit in every 10 times at bat than the other person. About every 2.5 games, they get one more hit. And I like to think of that. Nobody bats 1,000, and I don't have to get it right every time. But if 1 out of 10 days I'm a little more mature, my preaching is a little, I'm a little more differentiated in the study and in the pulpit, somebody's going to benefit from that, I think. And so without having to be a perfectionist about it, to just say, there are good days, and other days I'm my dysfunctional self and fall into victim to my own immaturity. So, but progress matters.
I love this analogy because it makes the statement about just a little bit more maturity can make a difference. Just a little bit more can make the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, it doesn't take much to see a lot of improvement. And I'm certainly certain that every member of any congregation I serve and every member of my family are glad that when there's a good day that Robert has. So they're happy for a hit, I know. So.
That's great. Skip, you have something?
Yeah.
You mentioned the baseball analogy. Ball players are now or coaches are using more on-base percentages because someone who's like a .250 batting average actually may get on base more often because of walks, other things like that. So
yeah, that's
some preachers may hit home runs every time they get to preach, but they may not be a full, complete pastor on base percentage.
Good point.
Yeah, when I talk about preaching and that, I there are days when I'm just glad to get hit by a pitch. Just if I can just get to first base in a sermon, that's a good day. But just in terms of everyday relationships, there are days when I see the anxiety, I'm more self-aware. I make choices instead of responding more reactively, and if I can pull that off one more time out of 10, there's a big improvement in how I manage myself, I think.
I sometimes use the illustration of a Mobius strip. You're familiar with that?
Yeah, the thing with one
I
side.
actually,
in and out.
Yeah.
I actually bring some strips into the tables and on a workshop, and I have people make them. And I say, look at the difference 1/2 twist makes.
Mm.
And I use the example of somebody who we were dealing with a difficult issue with a staff person, and we were going around and around for 45 minutes, and there was an introvert in the back of the room. And we said, "What do you think about this?" And she was taking it all in. She said, "You know what, I'm not quite there yet." And we said, "What do you mean?" And 20 minutes later, we had done a 180.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, just the idea that a small change in healthy functioning can have an enormous impact on the whole system.
There's a great description of the Mobius strip. You know this, Don, I'm sure, in Parker Palmer's Hidden Wholeness, which is really nice.
That's a useful illustration, I think, of a little bit. It goes a long way with just a little bit of improvement.
Yeah, Martin, did you have something?
Yes, I really liked the chapter on proclamation. I'm about halfway through the book, and because it certainly challenged me in terms of, and when I look at it, I think when I was younger, I had more hubris, and now I definitely have more cowardice when it comes to preaching. But I think that what it really got me thinking about was, how do I absolutely respect that somebody else, how do I approach preaching that it's not trying to convince somebody of something? And how do I approach it so that I show absolute respect to what that person believes, which is a really tall order, especially because preaching is a one-way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's no response time as a rule when preaching.
Yeah.
But I that chapter was just, it really got me thinking about, gee whiz, what, you know, how often am I fusing with my congregants as opposed to, you know, authentically preaching here, that sort of thing. So I appreciated it very much.
Yeah, I think that's a huge challenge for us. I mean, I don't know that there's many other times where the spotlight is on a person as much as it is in terms of how we're doing in relationships as it is in preaching. It's not just that, you know, we may be in a pastoral care situation and we're just one-on-one with someone and we're fused and all that, but there's not, you know, dozens and dozens of other people watching that happen, you know. But we're literally on stage in a sense at that moment with our maturity, and it's kind of scary to think about.
Other questions, comments, either in response to Robert's question or you have something? Yeah, Robert Holly.
I want to kind of answer the question by affirming what Don said about congregations having difficulty seeing themselves as systems. Having done a lot of workshops, when you hit the 5th session of workshop 1 and we start talking about mission and vision and things, I see a tremendous amount of resistance on all kinds of congregations. Things like, well, we did that 25 years ago and it's still good, Pastor, you know, that kind of thing. Or they will say something like, oh, well, we'll do it, but then they never act on it, or they literally just refuse to do it sometimes in a way. And it reminds me, if I can use the image of everybody rowing the boat we will call a church, and there's a lot of people sitting there when you introduce the idea that we're going to have a common goal called a mission, a direction, and they're sitting there thinking, well, I'm not going to row the boat. I came to water ski, and I'm going to get behind the boat and ski. I have no interest whatsoever in this mission stuff because that means I'm going to have to row. So there is a tremendous amount of resistance to seeing the family systems or the system we call the church, let alone our personal families.
Mm.
And, you know, the folks are real nice and they smile and they do the exercises, but you can feel the resistance to that. Every now and then I'd have somebody who would tell me that I had mission and vision reversed, you know, even though it's in the type in the page in the study guide that we're using. Just things like that, where they want to do agenda hijacking, all they can do to resist saying, yeah, we're really a system, and we need to row this boat together. Much what Don said, where it's not just about me. I'm not just a consumer here, folks.
I think one of the things that has become clearer for me in the last few years is, as I've worked in the area of spiritual formation, is the degree to which biblically spiritual formation is a community experience, not just an individual one. And that to read, I've started reading passages like Colossians 3 or Galatians 5 with a different sort of lens of the body as a whole. That those are, it doesn't come out in our English Bibles, but those are second person plural verbs all through there about you have died with Christ, you are raised. I jokingly down here, I preached a sermon on what I called y'all theology, which is, and I paraphrased Colossians 3 in the RSV, which is Robert's Southern version, and just put y'alls in there for all those you plurals. You can do the you guys where you are, I guess, but it's people, the vision for the body of Christ being Christ-like is not just about me, my being Christ-like. It's about our being Christ-like. And the fruit of the Spirit is not just something to be produced in me. The fruit of the Spirit is to show up in this body of Christ that I am part of. And seeing that system, the body, more clearly is a challenging thing in Western culture. I think we just are so individualized that we read those passages as if they were spoken to you instead of to you. And I think that's a systems issue. It is part of the resistance that is, I'm a consumer. I get to decide what I'm a part of. If my hand is part of the body, it doesn't get to decide whether it goes to the grocery store with the rest of the body or not. If that's where the body's going, then that's where the hand's going, but we tend to be consumers and separate ourselves out. That is, I wonder what kind of anxiety is reflected in that, I'm not comfortable enough being a part of other people. Maybe I'll be done in by them if I'm fully part of it.
You get permission to speak, so could you tell me?
It's 5:20. You said 5:20.
Emlyn, I wonder, this is Dick Betcher. I wonder if I might cut in at this moment and make a comment.
Certainly.
Well, I'm very sorry that I have to leave this session a little bit early because of a engagement that I have to keep at 5:30. So I didn't want anyone to think I was engaging in an emotional cutoff by walking out of here without announcing my my leaving. And I have found this to be very, very useful and interesting. And Dr. Creech, I'm about a third of the way through your book, and I find it very useful. I wonder, I'm looking forward to reading the appendix on the analysis of the family of David. And I wanted to mention Geraldine Brooks' book, The Secret Chord. Geraldine Brooks, the popular author, she's written a book about David and the David's family. And it's entitled The Secret Chord. I was wondering if you had possibly been able to look at that. And if not, I think you'd find it very fascinating. And with that, I guess I have to leave because my wife is standing anxiously at the door and wanting me to take my exit.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
What is the name of that book again?
It's called The Secret Chord. David, and Geraldine Brooks is the author. She's a very popular writer, and her son's name is David, and blah, blah, blah. You'll find it quite fascinating.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your good thoughts. Bye, y'all.
Bye, Dick.
Bye-bye. Thank you,
Bye,
Richard.
I'm sorry.
It's always
Emlyn,
good. Yes.
I'm finding that other people are in the midst of reading the book, and I don't seem to have received it yet.
We will check on that so that as soon as your membership gets processed, then Amazon gets notified and the book gets sent to you. So we'll make sure, I'll double check with Lynn, who's on the call right now, and we can see whether or not it's in process, Don.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep. try to process those as soon as they come in, but it takes a little time. So, and maybe Amazon isn't as fast as they claim.
Maybe they haven't figured out where Florida is.
Yeah, yeah. Other questions or thoughts, responses to Robert's question, or even a question of your own? So, Robert, what has been, you mentioned earlier that in looking at the text again, you can't quite remember the person you were when you wrote it, and that you have to reviews. Is there anything that has shifted for you now post publication in terms of your thinking, or something that's made that you're thinking more about?
No, I was telling Emlyn earlier, the whole process, some of you have written, and with Baker Academic, I turned this manuscript in, I think in November or the year before last, and a year and a couple of months later it comes out, and so I pick it up and read it, and it feel I could be reading your book. It just, it seems objective at this point. But I was telling Emlyn that I really wish I had read this book 20 years ago, which is to say, I'm grateful for what I've learned in pastoral ministry over the last 20 years. All of us wish we knew then what we know now, or understand. But at this point, I'm not sure that there's been any real shift in thinking about it, because there hasn't been a great deal of new experience in terms of things. I think it would be a useful thing for someone to write a book, or I could have included a chapter about interim pastoral work. I think that's, some of you are involved in that, and I've done that a good bit. And I think some small book that talks about using theory and working in interim pastoral, maybe there is such a book out there, I just haven't come across it. I think that could be a very useful application of the map, what's going on in congregations during that time from a theoretical point of view, and how might we manage ourselves there. It's something that every time I do interim pastoral work, I'm quite aware of the anxiety that's present there, and seeking to be maybe a less anxious presence with those folk, and they seem to benefit from that. I think a consistent voice in the pulpit, consistent presence in that interim time, but also somebody that's not too spun up about the fact that they don't have a pastor right now.
Yeah, interim ministry, and we, at least in this part of the country, in a variety of different denominations, we have limited number of people who choose that or have been trained to engage in those kinds of ministries. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in this group, actually, and experience on that kind of ministry.
In Texas Baptist Life, we have a training for intentional interim work. That's usually in churches that the pastor's departure is either after a long tenured ministry there, or under some kind of difficult circumstances. Places I go, I did spend some time in one that had been in difficult circumstances, but generally, I'm serving a church near San Antonio right now. I've been there for 8 months, and their pastor left to go to another congregation, and I haven't ever done that training, but theory does inform the way I enter and leave a situation like that, and how I think about the triangles that are formed there, and where the staff is during times like that. There are a lot of issues I think somebody could well put some wisdom on paper about. They were so inclined. Yeah,
Tony, do you have something? Tony's spouse is in doing interim work, so I was thinking maybe Beth could write the book.
Yes. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Creech, for your very thoughtful observations. My wife has done interim work going on 3 years now, and the things that impress me are the degree of anxiety by and large, that an interim walks into, like you said. And the tremendous effect she was described as calm, stable, and collaborative. That the tremendous impact, even though it may be 5 months or 2 years, that can have on a congregation in getting a little clearer about the direction that they're going.
Yeah.
And the final piece that she's in a denomination that is one that is operated with congregational polity, and that has its own particular challenges in terms of itself, as you well know. But the advantage of being an interim is to be able to absolutely be clear with that degree of affection and compassion without necessarily worrying about the reverberations, which hopefully will pave the path a little bit more effectively for the minister that comes into play. But that's very interesting that you say applying the theory to interim work. But those are my observations of just watching from the sidelines and developing an appreciation for it.
I think it could be useful.
So just really briefly, and we're closing here, but there's a movement in larger steeple churches to not have interims. And I've wondered about that as a response to heightened anxiety about what reactivity would mount about not having someone who is staying for a long period of time. Do you have any thoughts about that, Robert?
I don't. I also know that there is a tendency I've noticed among some larger Baptist churches in Texas, particularly where there's been a long tenured pastor, of not having an interim, but having a successor, someone who comes on a year or so before retirement, and then they do a handoff there. And I think the jury's out on how well that works. We'll have to see. I think it depends on the maturity of the two people involved.
That's what I would observe too, and I've only seen it work maybe once or twice, and it had to do with both leaders' maturity.
Yeah.
So.
That's the model that I came on after someone was there 33 years. They brought me on for like 11 months with him before he retired, and at this congregation it worked very well. I think it also has to do with the maturity of the congregation.
Yeah. I think those things are pretty well related into that, is what the congregation sees going on between those two pastors, and then the congregation's own level of maturity and sort of ability to be separate from that pastor that they've had for so long. There's a lot of challenges there.
Yes, Don.
I'm just saying, I know it's time to close. We could also spend an hour on what's going on at Willow Creek.
We'll schedule another time for that. How's that? Yeah. I just want to extend our thanks to you, Robert. Thank you for taking this time to be with us, and want to thank you for the resource that you've given to the church and to thinking about Owen and Friedman and others for the good of the communities of faith. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you for having me. And also, as you do read this and think about it, positively, if you find things that you have questions about that need clarity, I'd really appreciate an email and a response to that. Or if you want to just, get I don't care. I would like feedback as you have it, and would appreciate it very much. And I've looked forward to today, just a chance to talk with some folks about it who have at least looked at it. So some of you have read it, and that's good.
I found that, I mentioned this in my endorsement too, the appendices are fabulous. They're more resources for a map. So just if you've not gotten to the appendices yet, folks, take a look. So.
Okay. Well, and thanks.
Thank you very much. And my experience is Robert responds to emails really quickly too.
So,
I don't know, I'm not making promises for you though.
okay.
Robert.
And my email address is robert_Creech@baylor.edu. So I'd be happy to hear from any of you anytime. I don't know if this will ever be a second edition, but we have a second edition of The Leader's Journey coming out in next January, which was the first book that I worked on with a couple of colleagues around Bowen theory and leadership. And it's been in print for about 12 years, but it'll be a new version out in January. But there's a lot of revision that went in there because of feedback that we got and opportunities to talk with people about the ideas in there. So thanks a whole lot.
Okay.
And I'm gonna have another day to do this tomorrow down in Houston, live with a group of folk, and I'm looking forward to that conversation.
That's great. Folks, we're gonna close in just a minute. I wanted to just put in a plug for our May 31st event with Richard Blackburn. He's going to be with us in person at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Columbus, Ohio, but also we are going to have access via Zoom for folks that are at a distance. So registration for that is up on our website, so I encourage you to do that. And we're working on, we're almost ready to post the dates for our leadership series for next year, so that should be up on our website within the next 10 days or so. Thanks for being with us.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.